All right, today we're going to be working with expressions and equations that have absolute values with it. So if I look here, you're going to see that the absolute value symbols, okay? Now, just as a quick review, absolute value, if you have got the absolute value of 3, that's going to be 3. If I have the absolute value of -3, that's also going to be 3. Because the definition of absolute value, so absolute value, the definition is the distance from 0. Okay? So no matter what, our distances are always going to be positive answers. Okay? All right, so let's take a look at what happens on number 1 here when they ask us to evaluate. And if I look here, we have got m equals 4, so everywhere there's an m, I'm going to put 4 in. So I'm going to start here. I've got negative absolute value of 4 plus 6 minus 14 plus 4. Now, I am going to always do inside my absolute value first. If you want to think of it as a set of parentheses. And you have to do what's in here first before you can do anything on the outside. Okay? So I'm going to have negative the absolute value of 10 minus 14 plus 4. Now, the absolute value of 10 is 10, but this negative right here is just going to drop down. So I'm going to have negative 10 minus 14 plus 4. All right, so negative 10 minus 14 is negative 24, plus 4 is negative 20. And that's going to be my answer. All right, okay, let's take a look at another one here. All right, so now on this one we have multiple variables. So I have got b equals -3, so I'm plugging -3 in for my b value, and I've got x equals -4.1, and I'm going to put that in right here. Now I'm going to be cautious of these double negatives. All right, so as I start writing this, I've got the negative from the problem, and now I'm going to drop in the -3 plus 4 absolute value 2 times -4.1, because that's my x value, minus from the problem, and then I have okay, -3 absolute value. All right, so now we're going to do inside our absolute value first, just like order of operations. And so I'm going to have 2 times, actually let's go ahead and clean this up. Double negative in front becomes a plus. So I have a +3 plus 4 times the absolute value. 2 times -4.1 is -8.1. Double negative becomes a +3. Okay, still working inside my absolute value, 3 plus 4, and don't make the mistake of adding this together because order of operations says I've got to do my multiplication first. And on the inside there, -8.1 plus 3 is -5.1. Absolute value. The absolute value of -5.1 is +5.1. So now I'm going to do my multiplication next. So I'm going to have 3 plus 20.4, and then I'm going to add that up and get 23.4 as my final answer. All right, moving down to equations. Okay, now it does say solve and check each solution, then graph the solution set. All right, so now when we have absolute values, I'm going to come back up here. When we did our absolute value, remember that a positive and a negative gave me the same solution, okay? So we're going to address that down here on our equations. We're going to have a positive equation and a negative equation, okay? So when we write this out, we're going to have, drop off the absolute value, y plus 2 equals 4, and we're going to have y plus 2 equals -4, okay? Because we get 2 different solutions. There's 2 ways to get to a 4, a +4 and a -4, okay? So now, because we have 2 equations, we can drop off these absolute values. So now it's just solving. Subtract the 2, y equals 2. Subtract the 2 over here, and y equals -6. So since it asked us to check, if I plug this back in, I've got 2 plus 2 in absolute value equals 4. Well, so if I look here, the absolute value of 4 equals 4, so that's a good answer. Same thing here, negative 6 plus 2, and absolute value equals 4. The absolute value of negative 4 equals 4. That's also a good answer. All right, so now we're going to make our number line. Now when we graph, we are graphing our solutions, okay? So I'm going to drop this down here a little bit. And on my on my number line here, I've got a 0 in the middle. I got 1, 2, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, negative 6. So I'm going to have a point on 2 and a point on negative 6. Okay. All right. Next problem we're going to look at is what happens when we have an equation and it is set equal to a negative number, because this is a little different than back here when we had it set equal to a positive 4, okay? All right, so if you're thinking about this, and let's just set up our first equation, we have 3n minus 4 equals negative 1, all right? So I'm going to add the 4 over and get 3n equals 3, so n equals 1. So now when I do my check here, I'm going to plug this in and get 3 times 1, absolute value, minus 4. So when I look at this, I end up with the absolute value of 3 minus 4. So the absolute value of negative 1 should be equaling negative 1. So now if I look here, the absolute value of negative 1 is 1. So 1 equals negative 1 will not work. Okay? So anytime you have a negative number right here, anytime you've got this right here, it automatically makes it a no solution because your absolute value can't be negative. Can't happen. Okay? Absolute value can't be negative. All right, and our next problem here, we've got a word problem. It says the temperature of an enclosure for a pet turtle should be about 80 degrees. Give or take 5 degrees. Write an equation and find the range for acceptable temperature for the enclosure. Okay, so now you're actually going to write an absolute value equation, and they're all kind of set up the same way. But before we get started on that, the first thing we're going to do is define a variable. Okay, so if I'm looking here, it says find the range for an acceptable temperature. So I'm going to go ahead and say T equals temperature. Okay, now when it says give or take 5 degrees, we are talking about the word within. Okay, it's within 5 degrees. So when we set these up, we're going to set them up the same way every time. It's always going to be your variable minus an absolute value. Okay, so always set up the same way. Now, the inside number, when it says here, the temperature of the enclosure should be about 90 degrees. Okay, so I know it sounds kind of funky, but your total is actually always going to go on the inside. So this will be your total. Okay, and what I call the within number, how many degrees do we need to be within? We need to be within 5. We'll always go on the outside. Okay? All right, so now we're going to solve, okay? And I know that a lot of us could probably say, okay, well, obviously, if we're at 80, within 5 would be 75 to 85. I get that a lot of us could do that in the head, but we do have to write an equation here. So now we're going to go ahead and solve the equation. So I have T minus 80 equals positive 5. And then the second equation will be T minus 80 equals negative 5. Okay, so I'm going to add the 80 here, and T equals 85. Add the 80 here, and T equals 75. Okay, and again, writing a sentence. So the temp should be instead of within, let's say between. The temperature should be between 75 degrees and 85 degrees. So that would be our sentence. All right, last problem we're going to look at today. It says in 2007, a telephone poll was conducted to determine the reading habits of people in the U.S. People in a survey were allowed to select more than one type of book. The survey had a margin of error of 3%. Write an equation to find the range for the percent of people who read religious books. All right, so the first thing I'm looking is I need my information out of here, religious books. I don't care about the other ones. That's not what it's asking for. Okay, now, like I said, we know that the error means it's within 3%. So we kind of know that our answer should be within 3. If I go down 3, it's 63. If I go up 3, I'm at 69. So we kind of already know the answer there. But it does say to write an equation. So I'm going to start, again, with your absolute value, an equal sign. And this time we can use x, okay, and it'll just be my range. Okay, so x minus, and in this case, again, remember the total goes on the inside. So my total is 66. My within part is 3. Now solve both equations. So x minus 66 equals 3, and x minus 66 equals negative 3. Add the 66 and get 69. Add the 66 on the second one here and get 63. Okay, so the range is between 63% and 69%. All right, and so on your own now, you are going to complete lesson 2.5 in your textbook. You're going to do 1 to 6 and number 10 on a separate piece of paper.